Yeah, so Martín, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It's always a pleasure to have any opportunity to dialogue with you about our shared interests in critical social science. And on the question of ideology, let me offer a few opening remarks. First of all, I believe that the critique of ideology is an essential element of any critical approach to social science. We can't do critical social science in any coherent, politically meaningful way unless we begin with a critique of ideology. So it's very important indeed to get clear about what we mean when we talk about ideology. So ideology refers to the ways in which knowledge and power are intermeshed. There are a variety of different traditions for thinking about what ideology is and how it works, but the starting point for any analysis of ideology is the recognition that all forms of knowledge within the social sciences as well as within other fields are intermeshed with power relations. And with that in mind, I would argue that the core feature of ideology is that it naturalizes power relations through knowledge about the social world. So in other words, any form of ideology basically represents forms of power, inequality, exploitation, expropriation, dispossession, as if they were legitimate and normal. And in that sense, it renders them, it represents them as natural, it renders them invisible. And so the critique of ideology is essential insofar as it attempts to make visible, to reveal the ways in which power, inequality, dispossession, injustice operates.
Well, that sounds really relevant and really great way to look at the problem. But which authors or which particular frameworks do you think are particularly fruitful for a critique of ideology?
Yeah, so of course, there are many resources in the traditions of radical and critical social science for thinking about ideology. I, with my students, like to start with Marx and Engels, the famous essay, The German Ideology. And what they famously argue in that essay is that, that every ruling class in the history of the world, and specifically in the context of capitalism, tries to legitimate its domination over everyone else through forms of knowledge that represent their rule, their class rule, as natural and legitimate. So they have a very interesting account of how ideology works. And one of the things that they argue is that ideology is also effectively a form of practical consciousness. In other words, it's not something that the ruling class uses as a direct form of violent repression. It literally is a framework that oppressed populations and subaltern populations take for granted. So that's precisely how power operates, is through accepting a worldview that basically represents, your own subordination if you're not in the ruling class as legitimate. Another important theorist of ideology in more recent times, from the late 20th century, the French Marxist theorist Louis Althusser, has a very interesting observation in this context. He makes the point that ideology does not tap you on the shoulder and say, I am ideological. His point is that ideology operates precisely through its invisibility. So if it did tap you on the shoulder and say, warning, I am ideological, then we all might be a little bit more alert to the ways in which power literally inculcates everyday life and lots of the different frameworks that we use in understanding the world. But because it's so invisible, we have to do a little bit of work as critical social scientists to excavate how it operates. Let me concretize this a little bit further with reference to social science, because ideology is operative in everyday life, in social relations, in political life, But our starting point, of course, is the social sciences. How does it operate in the social sciences? So I would make the argument that all of social science is in some ways based on a variety of euphemisms that mask, that render invisible, and to some degree naturalize brutal forms of violence and inequality and injustice upon which modern social life is based. So the concept of society, what is society? We think of a kind of coherent, we might think of it in different ways, but one notion of society is that, well, it's kind of a coherent body of interdependence or system of interdependence, a division of labor. Maybe people have shared values about certain things, and it involves a process of reproduction. If you unpack that a little bit, as Marx and Engels do, as other critical social scientists do, within the Marxist tradition, within the feminist tradition, within traditions of queer theory, within post-colonial studies, there are a whole range of axes of inequality and social violence at work to produce something like society. Class inequality, different forms of gendered domination, gendered violence, forms of heteronormativity, obviously processes of racialization. And we can add to that various forms of ecological plunder and ecological destruction that are completely rendered invisible through any number of concepts that we use in the social sciences.
Wow, Neil, that's fascinating. I think that, like Althusser's claim that ideology never says I am ideological. It's a hugely relevant insight, which also points at the politics of knowledge underlying, like social scientific frameworks for understanding reality, like social reality, whether, like contemporary or historical, right? And so in that sense, like that begs the question, because ideology is not a topic that is usually like studied within, like mainstream social sciences, like there's a kind of a post-ideological, so to speak, consensus within social science. And so why do you think, students, like academics, like should focus on this concept? Yeah, of course, to uncover, like power relations, but in which ways are these, like relations of domination, like kind of, like obfuscated within mainstream frameworks of social scientific thought and knowledge production?
Yeah. So the fundamental question is, why do we do social science? Like, what's the point of it all? And there are different scholars, different students will have different personal motivations for why we're interested in the social sciences. I personally believe that all of knowledge, whether it's very technical, quantitative, or very abstract and theoretical, there's always a normative foundation, and therefore a political foundation for our interest in understanding social life. It's because we care about understanding our condition, what produced our condition, both individually, but above all collectively. And most importantly of all, how might we individually and above all collectively influence the pathway of social life. So again, whether it's a very technical quantitative analysis, a statistical analysis, ethnography, or spatial research of some kind, whatever the tradition, there's always a normative tradition, a normative presupposition. And I work in, both of us work in traditions of critical social science. And among all the disagreements that critical social scientists might have about method, about theory, and more, the shared assumption, the shared starting point, I would argue, is number one, the idea that knowledge in the social sciences is part of the very social world that it's trying to understand. It's not objective, outside, putting society under the microscope. We're part of the very world that we're trying to study. And therefore, that knowledge that we try to develop in the social sciences is intermeshed with the struggles, the inequalities, and the aspirations for a different world. So that's one starting point. And another key element of critical social science is unambiguously the commitment to use social science as a tool of emancipation. In other words, we want to use our knowledge of how society works, the struggles, the contradictions, the crises in modern capitalism as a basis for thinking about the possibility of alternative ways of organizing collective social existence. And that, for me, is also a core commitment. The reason I'm a professor, the reason I'm a scholar, is because I believe that the knowledge that we generate in the critical social sciences is essential for the collective struggle to produce a more socially just, ecologically sane, tolerant, cosmopolitan, nonviolent form of life, among other core concerns. So, given those basic priorities, the critique of ideology is absolutely urgent to the degree that the social sciences misrepresent or render invisible class inequality, gender inequality, racial injustice, environmental plunder, to the degree that they don't give us tools through which to think about the basic operations of power in social and political existence, then we have a serious problem. Because what could be more urgent than developing more democratic, more socially just, more environmentally viable forms of collective existence? And in order to do that, we need like rigorous and inspired and inspiring research tools. If we can't understand the basic underlying structures that reproduce class, gender, racial, ethnic inequality and injustice, how can we possibly develop institutional frameworks that are more socially and environmentally just? So from that point of view, the critique of power and the critique of how the critique of the critique of knowledge frameworks that render invisible power relations is an essential task of any critical approach to social science.